Good. Welcome. My name is Nancy Cushing. I'm one of the editors of the Radical Newcastle Book, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I thought that looking out on the audience today would be a little bit like being at a wedding when you look out and you see all kinds of familiar faces, people who've been supporters of the project for years. So very nice to see all of you here this afternoon. We meet today on Awabakal land, and I acknowledge not only their elders, past and present, and those of the Worimi people of this region, but also the young Awabakal men and women, boys and girls, who continue an unbroken presence in this place. So welcome to our people who've just stumbled across us and to our long-term supporters, for some of whom this might be the 5th Radical Newcastle event that they have attended since the project was initiated by my colleague James Bennett, who's out there somewhere wearing a very snappy red bow tie for the occasion, in 2010. So today we come together to celebrate the culmination of this phase of the project in an enduring form in a book, which hopefully will appear on many of your bookshelves, in libraries around the country, and internet booksellers everywhere. It will be launched officially by the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle, Professor Caroline McMillen, at 4, and I'm really pleased to see that Professor McMillen has decided to come along and hear some of the speakers from Radical Newcastle in this session as well. But the book is not the end of the project. It continues to have a life through its online presence, which is tirelessly curated by our wonderful archivist impresario, Johnny DeGravio. And through radical action and reactions to it. So, as we've seen this week, with charges being laid related to the sexual abuse of children by the Catholic clergy in the Hunter Valley, exposed by Radical Newcastle author Joanne McCarthy. So, a much more serious side of what we're doing. As we decided on the 30 pieces which would appear in the book, we realised that although we succeeded in representing the long sweep of European Australian history and a wide range of issues, there have been many more that haven't been treated. And so you might have turned to the index or the chapter headings and thought, but where is the Clara Street eviction riot, for example? Where is this? Where is that? And I almost think there could be a volume 2 in there somewhere. But for the time being, we're also hoping to keep placing new things on the blog so that we can keep telling the different stories, because there are so many stories of Radical Newcastle and of radical action yet to come. So for this session, we've gathered 2 contributors to the book, and the woman who many regard as the doyen of Newcastle radicalism. I've asked them each to speak for 10 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be allocated for discussion and questions. We'll wind up at about 5 to 4 and then switch into book launch mode. There will be some glasses and bottles of wine appearing and some beautiful trays of food that I hope you'll be able to stay and enjoy after we have the official launch. The first contributor is Professor John Maynard, to my right. He's a Worimi man who's established a reputation as a leading Indigenous historian in Australia. He's written on soccer and horse racing, on Aboriginal participation in World War I, and the parallels between Indigenous Australians and Native Americans. And he wrote for us about newspaper proprietor J.J. Maloney and his promotion of the status of Aboriginal people by helping Indigenous people to speak up for themselves in the 1920s and 30s. And we'll talk about Maloney today. Our second author on the platform with me is Dr. Daniela Heil. Her chapter and her talk are informed not only by her academic training as an anthropologist, but by her experience as a contemporary radical, defending the quality of life in urban Newcastle as president of the Newcastle Inner Cities Residents Association. Daniela will speak about the aims and strategies. Oh, sorry, I'm not the president. I've promoted her. I think it's one of the founders. Did I say that? Sorry. No intended slight against the actual president. And the situation which its members felt compelled to act against. We'd hoped for a piece for the book from our first speaker, Vera Deacon, but it was not to be. But I'm very pleased that she's able to be with us today. Vera is an elder amongst the radical community, I'm sure well known to most of you, with personal experience of the loss of environmental amenity with the extension of industry, the unemployed camps in the 1930s, and of being a communist when, to many, this was a fearsome identity to hold. In later life, she's reflected on these experiences, writing about them as an historian and as a creative writer, working on a number of causes and supporting regional history through the establishment of the Vera Deacon Regional Fund for the acquisition, preservation and study of regional historical archival resources. Now last year, those of you who were here will remember that Vera was handed the microphone almost at the end of the session. And then I, as chair, ended up in the dreadful situation of having to cut her off, having to say, wind it up, because there were people at the door saying, stop, stop, there's another session in here. I felt awful. So I've ensured that Vera is the first speaker today. We won't have to have any of that. And at the end, after the book launch, this is the final session of the day. So until the owners of the building actually kick us out, we can hang around at our leisure. So I invite Vera to address us now. Yeah, of course. Whatever you're comfortable with. Try that. Is that better?
Can you hear me if I stand up? I'll get more air in.
If you walk into the podium.
I'll get more air in my lungs. First of all, thank you. I'd like to say I feel a bit of a fraud. I'm also a coward and a bit of a mugbutt, but if you can put up with those defects, I'll give it a go. Because our chairwoman, Nancy, described me when she rang me up as the doyen of radical women, and I thought, that can't be, but I know there are women older than me, but most of them are in a home or very ill. But I was born in 1926, and I have there are three of us, three young women communists, and who are still alive. I am by chance the eldest by 2 months, so in that sense I am the elder. The second one is Iris Andrews, née Iris Morgan, the daughter of Charles Morgan, who was Secretary of the Ironworkers Association, who together with people like Charlie McCaffrey, Bill Hopkins and others, Frank Campbell, stood outside the BHP gates and helped to unionise it and get 100% unionism in the late 30s, early 40s, something which the company never forgave them. The third one is Janet Copley, who with her husband Mervyn have bequeathed to the University of Arts archive, which Johnny de Bravio's Cultural Collections section has archived and brought together. Janet and Mervyn left a great heritage of papers, not only about the Labour movement, Labour Party, Communist Party, the trade union, but also books hill. They went around taking photographs. Now, I'm July, Iris was born in October, Janet is in December, so I am the elder, but only by a couple of months. I'll leave it at that. So why am I radical? Maybe you'll get a few clues from my heritage, of which I'm very proud. Through my mother's Irish Catholic side, I'm descended from a woman convict who was sentenced in County Clare in 1839. She was a widow, a sort of laundress and dairy worker with 6 children, and she was sentenced for stealing. She came out to Australia in 1840, and her daughter Mary Redden married Daniel O'Connor Meehan, and I'm directly descended through my mother from that side. The other side is my father, who was born somewhere in England and brought out here, and when he was 8 years of age he was orphaned, or he believed he was orphaned. I've since found out, since he died, that he was actually the child deserted by his father, although his mother took him and his sister back. for a time, and she couldn't manage in 1912 and 13, with no supports for them then, and he was separated from her and farmed out into the Hawkesbury Valley. Only one family was kind to him, the McLaughlins. When he was 17, he was beaten badly by a man in Wollongong, and he rebelled by putting everything he owned into a sugar bag, including his banjo, and he took to the track. He went up and down New South Wales, almost to Queensland. Coming back at Grafton, he was taken in by a group of fattlers who could see he was a lad on his uppers, and they took him in as cook's spud peeler. And they said to him one night over the sing-song when he was playing the piano, playing his banjo, "You should go back to Newcastle, you might get a job there." And they smuggled him back by train, and he eventually did get a job in the coke ovens of the steelworks. My mother was born at Belfry Station, Scone, in 1905. Her father was a bullock driver who brought the shearings from Belfry's with his team. After the war, the first war, when 3 of his 4 sons returned from the war, he came down to live in Mayfield, and he worked in the coke ovens of the BHP before he died in 1921. My mother tells me that her brothers were 3 of the 30 that went from Belfry Station to the First War, and one of those men was an Aboriginal Douglas Grant. And Douglas Grant, my mother always called him her black brother. So I was lucky. I had one parent who had no racial prejudice. My other parent, my father, my beloved dad, he had an Aboriginal friend on the Hunter River called Moses. And I didn't know till I was 29 why Dad was so attached to Moses. When Dad came to Newcastle first, he found the islands, and the Mosquito Islanders took him to their bosom, and they nurtured him by feeding him burgoo, porridge to you, to fatten him up. That was the term. My father was musical, and he was a great funster, a great joker, but he had a lot of anger inside of him because of the way they had been treated as state wards. They were slashed under the showers in the morning with wet towels and sworn at. So he had very little respect for authority and not much respect for people he called silvertails or heads, and also screwnecks or wowsers to you. So you can see that this anti-authoritarian or radical feeling sort of was bred into me from my very birth. I was almost born on the banks of the river up somewhere near Toole Street. My mother went into labour there bringing their little horse in, because they had settled in a little house in a field between Woodstock Street and Toole Street. But I was actually born in Nurse Whiteman's in Hanbury Street. But I learned to crawl and walk there, and I heard the songs of the river. And we used to go down to the island and met all our friends there. In 1928, after Dad was burnt in the coke oven, we went to live on the islands. Hard times set in, and by 1933 we left the island. Dad felt he might have a better chance getting work around if he was on the mainland, as we called it, at Mayfield, but it didn't work out. We couldn't pay the rent in Pommy Town, didn't get enough work, despite selling fish 5 for a shilling and odd jobs. So we became inmates of 3 of the unemployed camps. My research has turned up the names of 23 places, which was published in the Newcastle Herald in 1992 when I wrote a story called In Houseless Poverty, published under the name of Wright in Shantytown. We lived first at Shortland in a sort of bush place, then we went briefly into a house on stilts on Platts Channel. There were about 17 of those there. Then we came up to Mayfield West Hill, and we were in what my mother called a burrow until Dad raked up 5 quid, as he called it, £5, to buy this bag house whitewashed with whiting, and we lived there till 1939. In that mid-period, Dad contracted a spot in his lungs that my mother held up, and we kept the family together. And in January 1939, she presented us with another sister, and we left the camp, and because we could rent a house, a pioneer's house on Mosquito Island for 2 shillings a week. So we escaped the last of the Depression. Dad found the strength to dig a big garden, and he was a wonderful gardener, and life brightened up a lot. Down on the riverbank lived a man called Ernie with his brother Ab. Ernie had crossed the river to help build the steelworks in 1913, and he worked in the blast furnace, and I used to hear the men talking about this company. In those days, they were glad to have the work, as an islander said, well, the work's made in Newcastle. It did in many ways. They created work, they trained people. I've got to wind up. Sorry. I haven't got to where I joined the Communist Party. It was inevitable. But VHP stood for big-hearted people, very ironic, broken-hearted people, and broken hearts for profits. And it morphed into Big Harry's people, Big Harry's place. I don't know how that came about. I think it might have been a public relations exercise to sweeten the name of the company as it was leaving in 1999. I may be very hard about it, but I had a love-hate relationship with it, because when I rode the river to work during the war, I rode my little green boat through its filth. The river was a sewer, was poisoned with oil and tar and all sorts of chemicals like cyanide, everything that went in. And the company remained very intransigent about doing anything, including the smoke nuisance. And the first thing I ever did was stand for election to council on an anti-smoke nuisance campaign in 1947. I'll leave it there, but I would like to show you this. This little award began in Newcastle by the Newcastle May Day Committee. It's called the Mary Gilmore Award for short stories and poems to encourage ordinary people to write poems and stories for their journals. A Newcastle man, Alex McLagan from Carrington, a former mayor of Carrington, he won it with an essay on the Clara Street case. I have a copy of that, 2 yellow typewritten pages. In 1957, I won it for the beginners section for the short story. I'm very proud of it. I invite you to have a look at it. It's very handsome, and that was a Newcastle initiative. The next one is I bought from Danny Boyd, a BHP man who was selling these. They were raising funds. It's an image of the blast furnace in the BHP. Danny belonged to a choir and he wrote poetry. Danny died recently, leaving a book of poems, and he also left this. It shows what I feel this Writers Festival shows to the world and shows to us, that we're not only industrial people, we're not only working class, we have the finer feelings and love of literature, music and all the arts, and I thank the festival for bringing you all here, and thank you.
Enjoyed hearing that perspective, and no, I don't think it was too personal, which is what you just said to me. I think it was perfectly pitched. So next we will hear from Professor John Maynard. John, were you willing to stay where you were?
I'll stay where I am, yes.
All right.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to share the stage with Vera, I have to say. I mean, I've had the pleasure of interviewing Vera in the past for the long play, I have to tell you, and that was a very rewarding experience, because Vera's memories are so rich, also imparting to me personally those experiences of living in depression camps with Aboriginal neighbours in regards to some of those memories that she shared. So she's a great walking and talking, if you like, archive for us here in Newcastle. I also want to acknowledge Nancy and James and Eric for pulling this book together. I know what's involved in being an editor of a book, and I think they've done an outstanding job. I know with the chapter that I did and on John J. Maloney, I wrote actually 10,000 words when there's 3,000 words a limit. I'll have to do more with that in the future, but of a guy who certainly deserves a bigger picture. I also want to acknowledge Joe Tregellis, who's in the audience here, and J.J. Maloney, who I feature on the chapter here. Joe is J.J. Maloney's granddaughter, and I certainly thank Joe for the letters and the photographs that and help she provided me with in putting this particular story together. J.J. Maloney, when you look back at it, is just such a champion, a courageous man, fighter, campaigner for the underdog in history of this city, and for basically was forgotten in regards to what he did and what he stood for. He was a fierce nationalist, he was a conservationist, an environmentalist, and a supporter and campaigner for Aboriginal people and issues long before any of those names even took place, people standing up in regards to that. For me as well, I think writing this particular chapter is something that I've felt's important for a long time. Certainly I've written a lot of stuff about Aboriginal political activism, particularly in connection with my grandfather and the rise of early Aboriginal political activism 90 years ago, and the importance of recognising those non-Indigenous people who were brave enough and courageous enough to stand up alongside Aboriginal people and fight for issues. And then we know certainly from the 60s, Charlie Perkins and the Freedom Ride, we've had the celebration of the Freedom Ride only recently. The Gurindji walk-off at Wave Hill, I should say that the Freedom Ride with Charlie Perkins, of course, there was Charlie and a whole bunch of non-Indigenous students on that bus from the University of Sydney who exposed the shocking living conditions of Aboriginal people in the state. The Gurindji walk-off at Wave Hill in 66, a lot of trade union support, a lot of, for the time, as a white media support. The 67 referendum with 92% of the population supporting Aboriginal people on issues. The 72 candidacy, Gary Foley and people like that will tell you there were a lot of non-Indigenous students and supporters as part of that very, very famous moment in Aboriginal political history. Now for J.J. Maloney, and again I acknowledge Joe and some of those letters, and I'll just read a few of the parts of the chapter. And he wrote to his daughter Agnes in 1924, and he offered her words of encouragement. And he said, "Kintakora is the Aboriginal slogan for fear not. So keep this musical phrase in your memory and have no fears of anything. Kintakora has been my motto, and by musing on it, I have arrived at that stage where I fear no one. And I want you to cultivate that same spirit of fearlessness, but never minus respectfulness. Be good, be kind, be true, be brave, fearless and happy, but also be careful." I think that opening sentence sums up who J.J. Maloney was. He was born at Menangle, southwest of Sydney in 1866, and he came to Newcastle in 1903, and he worked for David Cohen and Company, Co-Limited here. He was very instrumental in setting up the New South Wales Swimming Organisation, the Surf Lifesaving Clubs. He actually managed the first Australian international swimming team to tour overseas that went to New Zealand. He was the manager of that team. So here in Newcastle, when he arrived, he was instrumental in setting up the Newcastle Surf Club. He was involved with the United Charities Day organisation. He was president of the Newcastle RSPCA, vice president of the Newcastle Historical Society, the vice consul for Greece, secretary of the Australian Society of Patriots, trustee of the Longworth Institute, and a member of the Newcastle Hospital Board, just to give you some idea of this guy's commitment to the local community. But certainly, he also involved with setting up Bullbar Island out in Lake Macquarie as an environmental sanctuary, particularly with flora, native plants, bushes, and bringing in animals, as I said, to be kept on the island, which sadly for Maloney's ideas continued to be slaughtered by people who came out to the island and killed all the animals that him and the other people who were working with him set up on the island. But the most important thing for me, of course, was his stance of fighting for Aboriginal people. And I'll give how much longer I've got?
You have about 4 minutes.
All right, a couple of points in regards to that. He changed, which is an important part to say. I mean, he carried from a young life this picture of Aboriginal people as the noble savage, and he certainly wrote earlier on in that sort of vent, and as he went along he changed. But nevertheless, early on he said, the treatment of the native people of Australia is a black blot on our national history. The defamation of the Aboriginals is in a large measure traceable to the lessons contained in the school books. He was a great one for Australian history, not British history. He said there's got to be a new tack on this. We've got to look at the history of this place. Of the lessons contained in the school books, which were imported for use in the Australian schools more than 2 generations ago. If the books for use in Australian schools had been written in Australia by Australians at the dawn of our education system, things might have been different today. By the mid-1920s, he had connection with Aboriginal activists like my grandfather, Tom Lacey, Sid Ridgway, also a non-Indigenous woman, Elizabeth Mackenzie Hatton, who I've wrote about previously, another champion of Aboriginal rights. And he's writing even more powerfully by the mid-1920s through that connection to Aboriginal activists. And he says, the inequity of the position maddens me. To see these poor creatures kicked into the bush worse than dogs. Aboriginal people have been thrown off their land at this particular point, in the early decades of the 20th century. Their homes built by their own hands confiscated, no compensation, no redress. Their children kidnapped by the Crown and sent to work for Collins Whites at 6p a week, robbed at every turn, derided by all parties, every church equally to blame, priests, bishops, parsons, all equally guilty. And again, it was his daughter, Dorothy, was also instrumental with him in the Newcastle newspaper, The Voice of the North, which is the title of basically the chapter, John J. Maloney, The Voice of the North. And Dorothy was also followed her father's trench and a great campaigner, and I'll probably finish off with this particular quote. And Dorothy was writing about the shocking conditions of Aboriginal people that had been portrayed in the newspaper at the time in Western Australia. And she says, the camera cannot lie, and now Australia must be ranked with the Congo and Sudan in its treatments of human beings. I was also under the impression that there were Christians in Western Australia, but possibly I am wrong again. Yet I cannot remember a single utterance by any Christian regarding their barbarous treatment of the rural owners of this country. I never dreamed that the Southern Cross, which floated proudly on the peninsula of Gallipoli, would wave over conditions as delineated in that gruesome picture. There was a picture, as I said, of Aboriginal people in chains in Western Australia. But I'll finish on that note. But as I said, thanks to everybody who put this book together, and I really want to pay my respects to this champion, courageous man, John J. Maloney. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. You have paid him a great tribute. Now, our final speaker is Daniela Heil, and she was really hoping to show PowerPoint, but it looks like it's not going to happen. Technology has defeated us, I believe. So, are you able to speak without it? Okay. But we have a lovely round of photos from Radical Newcastle, and one of the things that was slightly disappointing in the book is that we couldn't have colour images, but we do have the colour images in a slideshow that we hope to have on the screen, as well as Daniela's PowerPoint, and I can put them on my little laptop and have them available during the launch, so that if you, while you're having a glass of wine, if you'd like to have a look at the picture, you can do that at the same time. So I'll turn over to Daniela.
Thank you very much, Nancy and James, for the invitation to speak here today.
I would also like to acknowledge my co-author, Jeff Evans, with whom I've actually co-written the book chapter. We're the last edition to this book, I think, because it's a kind of contemporary, ongoing issue as far as Radical Newcastle is concerned. We started NICRA, the Newcastle Inner City Residents Alliance, last year in March, after the Newcastle Herald announced on the front page one day for a period of 16 days that basically high-rise buildings for inner city Newcastle were in planning and had been proposed, which was a very complex idea as far as a kind of inner city heritage is concerned. And if most of you, I'd assume here in the audience, probably remember the pictures. I was going to show you a few of them simply as to kind of portray the visual effect, how high those buildings are and how they're not necessarily reflective of the heritage buildings in the city. Obviously, there are very diverse opinions, and what kind of made us as a group come together was that really many people and residents felt we have not been consulted in regard to this process. So a majority of us, and it doesn't only mean that we're actually inner city residents, but it also goes well beyond Newcastle to Sydney, and it even includes members who, for instance, have moved overseas but who still have very strong links to the city. What we did, first of all, in terms of after the establishment and various members sharing the same views and opinions coming together, was that we actually used last year's March in March 2014 as a platform to actually indicate, simply because the media were there, to our kind of discontent with how basically the planning and consultation process hadn't taken place. It was kind of quite annoying, if you like, was that always the argument was made, especially from local politicians, that a comprehensive community consultation had taken place. However, that had actually happened in regard to the Newcastle's urban renewal strategy, which was a process that had started in 2012 and continued into 2013. And that was a very comprehensive, covering many months at a time, right? So to then have basically a document with multiple attachments that altogether covered 1,100 pages, and to give the public 15 days, we were slightly outraged. We thought, okay, what can we do, right? And I think this is probably a very kind of what most humans do. I mean, you can be angry, but clearly that doesn't change anything. So what is it actually can do to make change happen and to try and influence decision makers in this process who appear to be in control of what is going on, right? And this is exactly what happened. So after the kind of initial placards we carried around at rallies, we launched a red balloon at the end of March, which actually indicated the height, those three high-rise buildings, proposed high-rise buildings, basically indicating the 15 to 20 stories, and altogether the highest being 69.5 meters, how high this would be. And it was really interesting because you could really get a sense what the floor space ratio would be and how that would actually impact on the city and the heritage buildings, right? So you kind of have very contrasting pictures that come to the fore. I would like to make the point, though, because we've often been accused of not promoting change and that we're against revitalisation. That is actually not the issue at all. Our point is basically, you know, if you come up with buildings like that don't actually quite match with
the rest of the inner city heritage precinct, you clearly need to kind of provide a kind of reciprocal platform of negotiations and consultations with the community to actually get a sense, is this actually what people want or not, right? And obviously also that actually requires kind of comprehensive engagement in terms of, you know, is this actually, have we done thorough research in terms of will these buildings, for instance, you know, will people buy these apartment blocks, etc., right? I mean, it's, at the moment, what is the kind of central issue is there is actually a lot of space and empty rooms available, right, that could actually, first of all, taken into consideration, right? And a lot of organic processes have started taking place over the last 5 years, right? And that is actually, I think, and I'm talking on behalf of NICRA more generally, what is required in those processes, because if you simply initiate change, but you're actually not working with local people and people who would actually, for instance, end up living there and working there, it's a bit difficult to impose something without actually gathering feedback and seeing, you know, is this what the community wants and will support. After the, obviously, what this also entails is, as I mentioned before, we spoke with throughout this process, and this sort of happens on a regular basis, depending on what the current issues are. We speak and have spoken with local politicians, we've had conversations with the Minister for Planning in Sydney, and many of our members, depending on who is available at a certain point in time and who isn't, will kind of respond to this and be part of this process. So clearly, we're not against urban renewal in any formal way, because this is sort of often criticised along the lines of, you know, you're representing a political party, or, you know, or you're basically, you know, you're actually against renewal, etc. But it's actually quite confirming that there's clearly insufficient consultation that has taken place, is that when rallies are held, and there often are kind of, we have social media, Facebook, etc. included in this process as well, we've actually reached a huge audience participating in this process. And that actually, when we organised a rally a while ago, we had over 1,000 participants walking down the mall, right? So, I mean, that is actually an indication on a Saturday morning that people are clearly not against, you know, or actually clearly not supporting what is actually initiated. We had some very interesting conversations, for instance, with a former member of Newcastle in regard to this, who basically said, you know, what would you like me to do? And the interesting thing is, of course, on the one hand, there was disagreement between those who visited him and what he proposed and how he proposed to go about it, but also that there is a kind of overwhelming emphasis on building for the sake of building, instead of actually saying what suits the area best, right? So one of the questions he asked us in response, when we said, you know, how about you take those kind of disagreements into consideration as well, was very clearly, you know, this is what progress is all about. Obviously, there are very fine lines what these areas describe, what they mean, and who participates in them in what way. But clearly, what we propose and have kind of reiterated throughout this process is that this kind of ongoing negotiations are a vital part of it. If the majority of the community says, we want these high-rise buildings, nobody will argue against that. That is actually the point with this, right? But this is also, in a sense, what I think representatives who are kind of voted into the positions have to ensure is actually happening throughout this process. Just finally, I want to make this point. We are not radical in the sense of, doing things or activities that are actually not demonstrating respect or anything like that. But it's kind of a form of this, or it's actually an idea, or it's a paradox of the radical, if you like, throughout this process is that microactivities are sometimes or demonstrate radical things to defend and conserve community values and heritage rather than embracing fundamental changes.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and to all the speakers. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions and comments. Do we have roving mics available?
I'd like to thank you very much for this event and congratulate the editor and all the people involved in actually bringing it to pass, and of course the culmination today with Vice-Chancellor. My question is on the fate of radicalism. And I'd like to start off by congratulating Vera, Deacon, whose radicalism is based on inequity, oppression, poverty, and who suffered during her life with her husband because of her social agitation founded in her blazing intellect, which we've been privileged to listen to. And I think it's a great honour for all of us. I speak from the other side of the coin in terms of people like me who were privileged with education. And my time in Newcastle started in 1980 when I was a foundation professor of paediatrics and came to a place which was on the downturn of radicalism, having been radical in the 60s and obviously earlier on. It was becoming conservative, and my chapter describes the clash of philosophy. And for people in my generation who are now old, our motivation for for activation and radicalism was social justice. History tells us that this really started, from my perspective as a child specialist, in the 1830s, where doctors lobbied for the Factory Act, which was to do with children working in factories of Lancashire and Yorkshire. And this, in fact, pushed along the health transition from 1870 to 1920 for children. But of course, this was grounded in the philosophy of Enlightenment. So the question is now, what's ahead for radicalism? For us of the older generation looking back, but also looking forward. After all, the motto of the university is looking ahead. What I see is the commodification of education and professional vocational training. What I fear is what David Madison would have said, the regression to the median. I see a loss of history. I see amongst my young specialist colleagues in their 30s, a method of learning which is entirely screen-based. Hardly any doctor under 40 reads a book. Everything is on an iPad or iPhone. And I worry about the way that the brain processes this information. There's certain information coming out from neurophysiology, but actually the brain acts in a different way, and that we not only don't memorise that information as well, but it's not actually processed into knowledge. So the question is, for Generation X and Generation Y, to reconcile these conflicts. That's your challenge, you young people coming through. Otherwise, it will put at risk the radical past of Newcastle, and it will end up as just a folk memory.
So the question is, the future of radicalism, where will it lie?
People felt that radicalism was dead in Newcastle. On the surface you can get that at times with the sonic with TV and other things, but there's a great spirit out there. It's not dead. Consider the struggle against the T4 terminal over there on the south arm of the Hunter, which is just an industrial canal from the days I rode across it, when it was very rough, and it'd take you 2 hours to get from Mosquito Island to Ingall Street, where the Black Wharf was, against a tide and a westerly gale. Now you can drive over it in 5 minutes, breathe in all the coal. So those people are a great struggle, because they're suffering, all the river suburbs, and so is Stockton. Then the struggle about the railway, inadequate consultation, lies. The city's name has been dragged in the dust by the crooks on both sides of politics. And all the decent people in both sides of the politics, make no mistake, they are. I've worked with Liberals and I've worked with Labor and all sorts of people. There are decent people in every group, but somehow the scum seems to come to the top. I'm now in my 17th year as a volunteer planter up at Kooragang, the Ash Island project, rehabilitating the only part of the islands that were not destroyed in the so-called island reclamation scheme. To me, the island destruction scheme, because what was done to the islands and the estuary is a crime against nature. Now, industry is relentless. I know we need industry, but we're being overwhelmed by technology, and somehow or other, for the very sake of humanity and our survival on the earth, we've got to get a better balance. So I say dead. And the little girl here has given you another aspect. All they're concerned about is development to make money. It doesn't matter what we destroy and how we damage the atmosphere, our Mother Earth, or how we damage and hurt human beings. So I'm flying the flag for radicalism. I'm still in there. It's true, we did suffer, my husband and I and our children, but we really lived and we survived, and I'm still going on, and so is my family. And my husband lost his work 3 times solely because of his politics, twice here in Newcastle and once in Sydney, but we survived and we won through. And I'm very proud to fly the flag of radicalism in all its strands. We've got to unite and come together.
Thanks very much to all the speakers. This is for anyone who wants it. I'm wondering your thoughts about a key challenge for radicalism going forwards and a key opportunity for radicalism too.
Well, following Vera's wonderful insight, there's concerns for me, I have to say. I think things have changed with the younger generations coming through. I mean, people are a lot more individualised in some respects. I think technology, though, is a way for the future. We saw that in the Middle East, in Egypt. I mean, radicalism certainly can take off with the use of mass media in regards to that, and getting the message across. In some respects, I also tie in with what frustration one feels with politics in this country. I mean, Gary Foley once said to me, and that's certainly coming from an Indigenous perspective, the Liberals, brother, will stab you in the stomach. Labor will stab you in the back. The end result is bleedingly obvious. We are going to get stabbed. And I think Foley covers the point of where we sit fairly well. Radicalism, again, even from an Indigenous perspective, I mean, the really proud grassroots, on the street, Aboriginal movement of the 60s, 70s and 80s, and this can reflect in the wider community as well. I think we had our swan song in 1988 with the bicentennial, and realistically, for us, I think Land Rights Act in New South Wales and native title has done an incredible amount of damage in many respects. Aboriginal people today, and that goes for the wider community and their political radical fights as well. We spend most of our time fighting and arguing amongst ourselves. I mean, so factions and divisions and infighting is sort of like the order of the day. And what Vera's call for at the end was, we need to unite and get back together and try to make change for the good of all people. I think that's instrumental in certainly radicalism.
I would just like to add something to that, which doesn't necessarily contradict what Vera and John have said. But from my experience, which only reaches and kind of refers to the last year, and I can sort of talk about the fact that it's not simply, referring to the participants in NICRA, the Newcastle Inner City Residents Alliance, that there is a lot of diversity, which is kind of the point John clearly made, and Vera's point about that we need to unify. NICRA is actually an example that demonstrates that it is a very diverse group, not only in a kind of political sense, but also in terms of interests, age groups, education, and the kind of multitude of participants in this process. And what sort of holds, for instance, the kind of continuing activities and protests together is that the common goal is to actually make a difference, even though it is a diversity that kind of characterises this process. So I think that's actually, the two are all together.
So I would like now to introduce Professor Caroline McMillen, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle. I'm sure she's well known to many of you. She's been in that role since 2011, so almost as long as the Radical Newcastle project has been around, so that's very impressive. And in that role, she has encouraged this project and many others which revolve around engagement with the local community in Newcastle and the Hunter and indeed the Central Coast. So it is linking the research that the university is doing with its community and her own biomedical research into the effects of maternal diet on obesity and cardiovascular disease in the future life of the babies who are born is very relevant to a region like this one, where both of those issues are very high on the agenda and affect many people. Now, I said to Caroline before, is it okay if I say this? And I thought she'd say yes. But some people might think, why is the Vice-Chancellor launching a book about Radical Newcastle? Isn't the Vice-Chancellor a pillar of society and quite the antithesis of someone who would be involved in Radical Newcastle? But I knew a little bit about Caroline's own background and thought that she could perhaps say something about that in launching the book. But also, I think she should be here because the university has been so important to Radical Newcastle. So her university, our university, Newcastle's university, features in several of the chapters. Many of the authors are from Newcastle. The records that we used are preserved by the University of Newcastle's cultural collections. So everywhere you turn, and turning to that question of where to next for radicalism, I think the idea that we are now educating such a large proportion of people growing up and becoming adults in our society, and things that we do are things like critical thinking, things like questioning, having the knowledge and the confidence to say, I don't like the status quo, I'd like it to be different. That might be changing in any direction, but I think that is where the terms of radicalism can be sown for the future. So, with all that in mind, I'd like to now invite Professor McMillen to the stage to launch Radical Newcastle.
Thank you very much indeed, Nancy, and I too would like to acknowledge the Wormai and the Wabakal people, on whose traditional land we meet on this rainy day, but where there's a great warmth in this great hall. And I pay my respects to those elders, both past and those present. Well, I got set a very tough job by Nancy. I firstly had to reflect on my radical origins. That's a tough one. I then had to reflect on the role of the university in the context of Radical Newcastle, less tough. And least tough of all, actually, was to then introduce the elements of this great book and officially launch it. So the toughest of all was reflecting on my own radical past. And I went to the book for the definition of radical, as a good academic should. And the definition of radical in the introduction of the book is advocating thorough or far-reaching political or social reform, revolutionary, especially left-wing. That gave me pause. It gave me pause. Because it is absolutely the case that I can look back in my own family to that radical stock. My sister recently, who has done an enormous amount of work on our history of our Irish family. We originally came from Scotland and moved to Ireland, but had been in Ireland for several generations. And she let me know that actually we had a key role in our ancestry in terms of the Highland clearances. Those of you who may know, these were appalling clearances of tenants and crofters of whole tracts of Highland land, so that the costly business of having small holdings could be removed for the economic benefit of moving to sheep farming. And one of our relatives, Catherine Ross, from the Ross clan, played a major role in fighting back the forces that came, and these were murderous forces. And when the men of the village failed to act, she led the women against the intruders. And indeed, there are notes that she was wounded in the battle as she led the villagers across the ford. So this is somehow speaks to that female leadership role, and going back through again into one's origins and the voices of one's past as a child growing up in Belfast, where our family, my father's and mother's family, were very much in the shipyard workers and also the printers, the printing presses and compositing of the Belfast Telegraph. And I remember the front room of my grandmother's house where there was great debate. And it was passionate debate. It was debate about the history of Ireland, and you can fill many decades of debate about the history of Ireland from the north and the southern perspective. I remember hearing about the black and tans. I remember hearing all of those issues being fought fiercely by debate, the power of the word. And in my own family, my father, who absolutely started in the printing presses, and then through going and serving in World War II, had that opportunity, as returned servicemen did, to actually engage in education. And it was his passion for education and the word, the pattern of the word, the book, poetry, plays, whether it's Brendan Behan or whether it was Samuel Beckett. I mean, these were the childhood memories of living in a country in which there was always debate and always absolutely a book to be found, and it was important to be found with a book. And from that, then in the times of the Troubles, we moved to Scunthorpe in the north of England, which is an absolute steel-making town. And I remember clearly coming to this completely new world from the harbour city into the steel-making city, and in the evenings of the winter's evening, when all the men, and they were men in the majority, who would ride their bikes through and past as the time for finishing the shift came, and they would all come through, and then you would engage and in your family, in your social groups, and find out what was happening in the city. And the city itself was hard, it was tough. But it was a remarkable city, and with remarkable people who below that veneer of toughness We're absolutely committed to community and absolutely committed to supporting you as the next generation, what you wanted to do. So for me, those threads went through my childhood, but when I think back to radical, would I be an occasional radical, a reluctant radical, a periodic radical? Because growing up, the world is your future. This is the now, but it doesn't necessarily belong to you. You see your future as different, necessarily so. I love actually, particularly thinking about women and their futures. Mary Lou Pardue, who's from MIT and was the Dean of Science there, and she reflected, and she was reflecting about women in academia and science in particular, but her quote would have held to me at that stage, which was, every generation of young women began by believing that gender discrimination was solved in the previous generation and would not touch them. And I was quite clear. In now the late 60s, the early 70s, that was quite true. And so whilst what had held before I found of interest and absorbed it rather than analysed it, I knew that for me the future was different, and I managed to in some way stumble through. A teacher, a chemistry teacher in my sixth form college said, and this was in Scunthorpe, said, "Why don't you give Oxford a go?" I didn't know what that meant, give it a go. Sounded interesting. It meant doing an exam. Well, did we have any copies of the exams? Not exactly. I arrived in Oxford, and I arrived in having got time off from my market job, and Mrs. Bale, who was my boss in the market, said, "Okay, lass, but you'll be back next weekend." Yep, I'll be back next weekend. And I went to my interview at Oxford in my pink flared jeans and my very best short top and my sort of sneakers, feeling quite the girl, and found my way to the sherry party, where all the candidates were being introduced to each other. You know, how lovely is that? And it was a different world. It was a completely different world. And I do tell this story, but it is a true one, that I walked in and the medical tutor said as I arrived, "Oh, jolly good. Yes, you're from the north. North, yes. Good. Terrific. Right. Well, let's meet people." And this was a wonderfully new world. And then, because this was actually part of the interview, although you didn't know it at the time, everything was part of the interview. In fact, you didn't like sherry, was part of the interview. And she said, "Right, okay, we're talking about original sin. What do you think of original sin?" I didn't actually know what original sin was. I was a Presbyterian family, you know. And I just knew that, you know, in Ireland, when you don't know something, you don't give ground, you don't apologise, you hold your position. So I said, "I don't believe in it." Of such things are futures made. She could have said a perfectly reasonable question, which would have been, "Why?" Luckily for me, she turned to the girl beside me, who was a little bit pale at this point, and said, "That's an interesting answer. What do you think?" And so it was that coming into that transformative experience, for me, Oxford was not necessarily a representation of a class-based education, and it could have become so, given the figures that would show that indeed having what we would call a private school education, called our public school education, was actually almost de rigueur to Oxford. It could have occurred to me it was discriminatory, given it was 4 places for every man to 1 woman, but it didn't. I just absolutely began to again look forward, move into a future. And it is really only, I think, that ability for a generation to be sure they can move unimpeded that actually allows them to be radical, because they are not assuming they will be held back. They are not actually seeking to have a fight with the present. They are seeking to shape a new way of doing things and assume it is possible. And I think that's a tremendous way forwards for all next generations in the face of some clear evidence that this may not be easy. And I remember leaving for Australia on the eve of 1983, and it was the eve of the re-election of Margaret Thatcher. And I remember it coming through the radio, and I knew I was doing the right thing. And I knew this in the face of my Cambridge consultant, who had then done my medical training, had bailed me up against the wall and said, "Now, I hear you're going to Australia." "Yep." I'm like, yes, I'm going for a year. Tried to make it sound like a little year, 30 years later, but never mind, a little year. Said, "Well, it will be the end of your career, that gap." Right, okay. I'm thinking, I'm not sure what I'm going to say here, except, "Oh, right, I didn't realise that, I'll cancel it." No. So what I said was, "Look, I appreciate the advice, it's tremendously helpful, and I'll sleep on it, call on the plane the next day." Because it was that sense of the world was created in a particular shape and form, and that I didn't know what Australia would hold, but I knew it was not like that. And arriving in Australia was for me that reconnection, in a sense, to a society which was not defined as closely, I would say, as closely by the school you went to or the Oxford College that you sat at the round table at. And one of my first experiences was in Melbourne watching a television ad where there were an electrician and a plumber sitting on a surfboard and talking about how they were going to go fishing, and it was bright and they were great, and I thought, that would never happen in Scunthorpe. This is just a different place, and I had to understand this different place and what it meant for me. And for me, moving through then to address that, and of course over age and time, you become much more clearly aware of what it is you must make sure does not happen again, or that we do not go backwards. And one of the least positive elements of that has been perhaps the journey of a woman in science, where I was part of the Science and Gender Equity for Australia Board, who's been meeting recently to talk about bringing in a new and appropriate system from the UK that has begun to be an active intervention to improve equity, particularly for women in science and medical and engineering research. And the figures are startlingly similar to those that were, as it were, in terms of when I thought the world had changed and gender discrimination had been solved. And mainly the quote that finishes of Mary Lou Pardue in that regard says, "Gradually, however," and she's referring to women scientists, "their eyes were opened to the realisation the playing field was not level at all, and that they had paid a high price, both personally and professionally, as a result." And it did seem to me that that was a key issue for me in leadership to begin to address. The second part was in coming into academia. I felt of all the professions, academia is more a meritocracy than others I had seen in practice. And for me, an academic environment is one in which everything is challenged. The notion of being a radical should be challenged. The notion of, is radicalism about the status quo, should be challenged. The notion of the future of radicalism should be fiercely debated, because in that domain we're owning the future of what actually the next generation of radicalism will become. And I have great hopes and absolutely clarity that in Newcastle we have generations of students who will reinterpret radicalism in their own way, as they should. I think technology will be the saving of radicalism. I actually think that we have social innovation, and our students who really want to contribute to change the world, have an impact on social values, but with a good business model. But it's a different business model than the one that's characterised what's been before in terms of the bottom line. So I see coming to Newcastle a remarkable institution. We come up to our 50th year and we're celebrating the birthday the whole year. It's a big party. And reasonably, what I see in this institution, it has earned the right to champion and be seen to be the leader in equity. 45,000 people have come through our Open Foundation program to get qualifications to come into university in the last 40 years. our Indigenous education with leaders such as John Maynard, the Wallatook Institute. I was completely taken aback when I came to Newcastle. We are the quietest achiever for the greatest delivery of absolute equity and access and participation in higher education. Absolute pleasures last year, in fact, was going to the British High Commission to hear 6 scholarships given nationally to Indigenous students to go to Oxford and Cambridge. 2 of those students from the University of Newcastle, Jessica Buck in oncology and her PhD, Nathan West, he'd done a Bachelor of Construction Management, he's doing anthropology in Cambridge. Now that's what a remarkable institution does. It places no barriers on aspirations for bright people, but the journey to that point has required generations of staff, generations of radical thought, disruptive innovation, determination that has resulted in that outcome. And we have to ensure that we do not become fixed in time, but that those outcomes also are possible by the way in which we respond to our changing environment and also trust the next generation. So I'm absolutely delighted to have supported, through the university's support, not only in some of the sort of financial support. That's not what it's about. It's actually about, again, those people as academics whose lives are about taking apart and putting things back together with greater value for it having been put back together, that cause us to think and reflect, not all of whom we will agree with, and neither should we. Somebody in the business community said to me, Caroline, your staff always seem to disagree with things. I said, absolutely. We are professional disagreeers. It's our profession. That's what we do. We disagree, we dissent, we reflect. We have fierce arguments with our colleagues. I'll come back from a conference and I'll have argued fiercely about an epigenetic marker and a histone group and an acetylation process, and my family will kind of go, great, terrific, really good, you can have that debate, but why is it important? And our importance of all of those elements are the importance of ideas, words, and moving ourselves forward. So as a university that champions equity, the fact we champion excellence beside it seems to me to be at the heart of this book. Great scholarship brings about a great capture and synthesis of some complex ideas that cause us to challenge our belief systems, consider whether they're fixed, and then move on in our own thinking. And so for me, hearing about the history of Radical Newcastle from Nancy has been wonderful. And I'd just like to articulate some of that. What I should say is a personal thank you to Nancy. Many of you may not know, I was challenged, as Vice-Chancellors often do, to write 7,000 words on how our city had built the university and how our university was supporting a city in transition. Now, they wanted 7,000 words. This was for a book that was being published. It is now published, along with chapters on Berkeley, Cambridge, Simon Fraser University, some great universities in the world. We were there. It's fabulous that people hear this story of this city and its university. I knew I had 7,000 words. I could write 500, I thought, at a pinch. This kind of history. And I said, who have we got? Nancy Cushing. Nancy was on study leave, I think, at the time. Long service leave. The inner academic. And she said, yeah, I'll do that. It was beautifully written. It started, Newcastle, like all post-colonial cities, was born modern. And she just had me in that first sentence. Beautifully written. I'm delighted that it's absolutely got the interest it has. And it told me again, as I reminded every day, the absolute excellence of our scholars. And the engagement piece. Equity and excellence means nothing if you're not engaging as a university. So what's our role been? And this is where I can weave now the story of the book. So the Radical Newcastle Book, as many of you know, has been built on a series, Radical Sydney, Radical Brisbane and Radical Melbourne. And the ideas came together as great ideas do. I'm envisaging over a glass of wine or a beer or a coffee. But it came from Dr James Bennett, a senior lecturer in history, who's our Labour historian, and he brought in Nancy, and senior lecturer in history and specialist, as you've heard, in Newcastle, and Associate Professor Eric Eklund, formerly of the University of Newcastle and currently Keith Cameron Chair of Australian History at University College Dublin. Now James appropriately really saw this and envisaged it as a community project, and so people came together. We've heard of the importance of bringing people in and all the different views right from the get-go with key projects, and they began to talk about what might constitute this project and how might one reflect on Radical Newcastle people and places and purpose and history. There was symposia held at the University Art Gallery back in 2011 and University House in 2012, and here at last year's Writers Festival. People often reflect how long it takes academics to do things, but we like to do things really thoroughly, and in a project such as this, inclusively. And of course, while all of the contributions came through, the critical role has to be acknowledged. And there was a virtual presence in the Radical Newcastle blog, but a critical role of Johnny DeGravio and, of course, our university archivist, who, when I first arrived, made sure I had the white gloves on to go and look at the archives within about 3 days. And Greg Heathcote, who's our archive assistant. And so they played an absolutely critical role because they understand the importance of memory. And they make sure our archives are not dry and dusty. They are purposed to good effect to not only reflect on the past, but for our students and school students to show the place of the past in the future. So the book contains, and I haven't read all of them, Nancy, I confess this now, but I will, contains 25 scholarly chapters written by academics from across the university's faculties. I have read the wonderful chapter by John Bolton on the disruptive innovation of the new medical program. I too, and John, I can recall in the 80s I was at Monash and subsequently Adelaide in medicine, and I can recall people saying, sort of Newcastle's doing this problem-based learning thing. Well, that's never going to catch on. And there you go. Again, absolutely clearly out there and being at the heart of it a values-based change in medical curriculum. We have academics who contributed from 7 other universities, that wonderful global academy that exists, and independent scholars, and of course my very first handpiece, The Voice of Contemporary Radicals. And today, Vera, Deacon, who I know has not contributed to the book, but just that power of that voice, Vera, just since I've met and had the privilege of knowing Vera, I've just always being an occasional radical is not enough. Now, I think clearly they've brought the whole of Newcastle's European history and that early convict history, of course, through all the way to the ICAC revelations of 2014. So that's a span. We have some really interesting chapters. Anne Hardy and Johnny DeGravio's piece on how local action averted a plan to remove nobbies from the harbour mouth by blowing it to pieces in the 1850s. It's always a good solution, don't like to blow it up. And they argued that was the first environmental movement in Australia. Rod Noble and Eric Upland chapters which show a determination of local workers, particularly miners, in the late 19th century to stand up for their industrial rights, even in the face of the Northern Felt's machine guns brought in by the colonial government to intimidate them into submission. A full account of the Rothbury riot in 1929 by David Baker about the fate of a protesting miner killed by police. And Artist Bernadette Smith's account of the very iconic Radical Newcastle event, the Star Hotel riot, 1979. And of course, the award-winning journalist Joanne McCarthy's account of dogged commitment to exposing sexual abuse within the Catholic Church in the Hunter region. And the great thing about this book is that convicts, miners, the church, journalists, steelworkers, Indigenous people, this is not simply about political movements or union movements, it is about the whole fabric of a city and what the roles and occupations and interests of people have made it up and their role in the radicalisation of Newcastle and in moving the stories forward. We also have the book, we've heard from John about John J. Maloney, and there are also the stories of John Maxwell, who won a Victoria Cross for his bravery in World War I, and he came home to tell the story of the ordinary soldier at the front. Bishop Ernest Bergman and Father Alf Clint, both with compassion for working people that really informed their views and their actions. And Divna Cusack, who drew on her years teaching in Newcastle during World War II to produce a novel that captured that social and economic contradictions at the centre of what is and what was an industrial city. So I think not only is there the capture, there's also the maps, and so we can go on a Radical Newcastle tour, and that's important because this is a book about place. It is in the place and in the envisaging of the events that one really captures that intersection of the movement, the argument, the debate, the individuals involved, and where something happened is the power of history. So I think reasonably, whether you're talking power of dissent and atheism or anti-war movements, or one's talking the power of purposeful change and environmental protection and community action around events such as a local swimming pool at the heart of a community and families in that community. The notion and the clear thread is that radicalism has worked to change society for the better in this in the last 100 years and more, 200 or so years of Newcastle's history. And it has operated against other more powerful forces to protect those without necessarily a voice, a way forward, or sometimes without any resources for themselves or their families, and with no hope, often without champions who have taken up their cause. So as a university that at all elements seeks to ensure its values of equity and social justice are actually not only upheld but imbued across all of what we do, it has been terrific to support this book, and it gives me great pleasure. And I think formally launching books tricky, champagne can't crash against it, but if I say it gives me great pleasure to launch Radical Newcastle, edited by James Bennett, Nancy Cushing and Eric Eklund. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was great. So now I'd like to invite to the stage my co-editor, James Bennett, who is going to just briefly respond. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your wonderful words and insights, Vice-Chancellor, and a very big thank you to you for support of this project that made the book possible. Let me also acknowledge the Faculty of Education and Arts for providing us with the critical support that we needed to allow us to employ our wonderful research assistant, Emma Hamilton, who became a key go-to person in the editing process. Now, I was looking back recently at the minutes of the first meeting we called way back in 2010, as Nancy was saying before, when we set out on something of a wing and a prayer. There were 23 people in attendance. Little did we suspect the challenges that lay ahead of us at that time. One person at that meeting who was unable to see the final outcome was Emeritus Professor Alan Ward. Alan sadly passed away late last year, but it was very characteristic of him to show interest in and support of projects such as this. Others, like Professor Anne Kirkboys, who's with us today from Sydney, and Professor Peter Heppenstall, joined our project and added much vitality. Anne and Peter both gave papers at a symposium we ran several years ago in the University Art Gallery, and both were on the panel at last year's Newcastle Writers Festival. The photo in Peter's chapter on page 81, The Bishop and the Bolshies, is one of my personal favourites. Just a quick footnote to the Vice-Chancellor. A little over a year ago, at an end-of-year function, you gave me a 15-year service award and asked me what my best moment had been with the University of Newcastle over that time. Well, can I update that answer I gave to you at that time? Because I think this book might just be that moment. My co-editor, Nancy, has played a critical role in producing a quality book and steering it to completion. Nancy's a Newcastle specialist, and that expertise was invaluable in enriching this collection. She was dedicated, energetic, and skillful in her role. And can I add one other adjective to the list? Unflappable. In the middle of last year, when the publisher told us how much time we had to knock everything into shape, just a few short weeks in the middle of a busy semester, my inner voice, much like a petulant former tennis great, said, "You cannot be serious." Nancy, on the other hand, barely seemed to draw breath as we moved into the final phases, or so it seemed at the time. In late 2013, the editorial team was joined by Eric Eklund. Eric now lives in Victoria, but has had a long association with the university, as the Vice-Chancellor indicated. Unfortunately, it was a little too far for him to come today to join us. As the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, he's taken up the Keith Cameron Chair in Australian History at University College Dublin. Eric also brought particular strengths to the editorial team, including his specialist knowledge in regional history and labour history. I want to thank all of the contributors to the book, and there are many of you. It's your narratives of radical lives that gave us the material we needed to create this book. From the very beginning, it was very much a book that responded to the concerns and interests of our network, and most especially our contributing writers. So in that sense, you helped us to frame radicalism in the broadest possible way. We also appreciate your forbearance in what turned out to be a very long process. And can I also give special thanks today to Anne Hardy for not only writing her chapter with Johnny, but her contributions to today's catering. Sometimes historians are challenged by narratives that are so familiar to us that we really need to stand back to get some critical distance that's vital to thinking about them in fresh and meaningful ways. Those of us who teach and write about Anzac and the First World War will know exactly the kind of challenge I'm talking about. Other times, the challenge lies in bringing to the surface previously suppressed narratives, and that's exactly the purpose of Radical Newcastle, and the idea is embedded in the original subtitle of the book, Unearthing the Radical Past and Present of Newcastle and Hunter Region. And I think John Maynard's address today was absolutely perfect in illustrating that idea of a suppressed narrative that needed to come to the surface. The ideas and aspirations of many of our radicals demonstrate a much richer, more diverse and colourful side to Newcastle and the Hunter than many of the old stereotypes presuppose. I think these stories also help to demonstrate the significant role Newcastle has played not only in New South Wales, but in Australian history more generally. There are many others who deserve to be thanked for their support. I don't have time to name everyone, but I would like to draw your attention to the acknowledgement pages at the front of the book where hopefully they're all mentioned. I do though want to make a special mention of two people in cultural collections in the University's Moody Library who were indefatigable advocates of the project and who breathed lifeblood into it from its inception. They are Johnny Garavio and Greg Heathcote. I was going to go on to say that Greg's responsible for this wonderful slideshow. Technology has not been on our side today. And I do know, because I saw in cultural collections, Greg showed me last week, it pays tribute to an enormous cast, including two young radicals, Ben Morrow and Peter Gray, who is sadly no longer with us. The book is dedicated to Ben and Peter. And Johnny, among many other things, he wears many hats, created and maintains our Radical Newcastle blog spot, radicalnewcastle.wordpress.com. Johnny said to me recently that cultural collections sow many seeds. Some of them don't fertilise, but others take hold and flourish. This is one of those seeds that owes much to the people, ideas and vitality of our cultural collections staff. There will be audiences for the book well beyond Newcastle, but it is a book intended above all for the Newcastle and Hunter community. As I think Nancy mentioned before, there are different lives to this book. I think it can have several lives, and I'd ideally like one of those lives to be as the centrepiece of an exhibition featuring photographic material and ephemera that tells the story of Radical Newcastle lives. Our contributing writers can supply the raw material. One of them, Angela Philp, has the curatorial experience, and with some support from a co-curator, an exhibition space in the city, and a little help from the university, I'm confident this can happen. So finally, thank you to everyone present today for coming and supporting this event, and we really hope that you enjoy this book.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you, audience. We will release you now. Please do enjoy a glass of wine, one of the lovely fruit sheets and so on, and buy a copy of the book. Thank you.